Welcome to Atlanta History Center. To those of you I have not yet met, my name is Claire Haley. I'm our Vice President of Public Relations and Programs, and I'm just so thrilled that all of you are here tonight and that we have the incredible opportunity to host our two very special guests tonight, journalist Ernie Suggs and Ambassador Andrew Young. When I was trying to think about how to summarize Ambassador Young's career in something short enough for an intro, I arrived at the conclusion that that wasn't entirely possible, but suffice it to say that every major historical moment in Atlanta since the 60s has been something that Ambassador Young has been a witness to, a participant in, and a key integral part of our history of this city. And it's just such a pleasure as Atlanta's History Center to have you with us on stage this evening. The book, if you have not yet purchased your copy, is beautiful. It contains so many wonderful photographs and stories and memories, and it was put together by award-winning journalist Ernie Suggs. If y'all saw the article in the paper the other day, it just gives you a little taste of what you can find in the book. If you have not yet purchased your copy, you can do so after tonight's talk. It's 25% off tonight only. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's very special guest, Ernie Suggs and Ambassador Andrew Young.
Well, thank you all for having me. As she mentioned, I'm Ernie Suggs. I'm a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a longtime reporter. So that's my day job, and my night job is writing books about famous ambassadors. So I'm happy to be here, and Ambassador and I have been all over the country pretty much promoting the book and talking about the book. And we've had some great conversations, and I hope that this is going to be another one right back home. You know, it's always important to come back home. So thank you all for coming. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have Q&A, 45 minutes of conversation, then Q&A. So have your questions lined up. So Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just start off, Claire talked about how the book is doing and just how it's this great look at your life. And, when you look at this book, you've written your own autobiography. There have been many books written about you. What's different about this book in terms of telling who you are, telling your life story?
Well, this book's in pictures. And the people who put it together really did a phenomenal job. Not only your writing, but,
Donald Bermudez.
Donald Bermudez. My mother was, in New Orleans, when she was married my father, school teachers couldn't remain teaching if they got married. Mm-hmm. So she stopped teaching and started working at an insurance company. And she just kept everything. Every letter I wrote, she had somewhere. And then at Tulane University, just before Katrina, she decided to turn everything that she had about me over to Tulane University in the Amistad Library. And so there was stuff that I didn't know that was there. I was always aware of the fact that, I came down to work with Martin Luther King because I said nobody ever writes about history from inside. That it's usually, best example is, it's a very good book, Taylor Branch.
Yes.
But Taylor Branch was a student at, right here in Atlanta High School, Northside High School, at 16.
Westminster.
Westminster. And he did an excellent research job. But I was trying to write about it from inside, what was going on in our minds, what was going on, and what we were afraid of. What really was what was really happening spiritually. And unfortunately, the New York Times nor the Constitution ever get that side.
Uh-huh.
You know, I mean, I think of the civil rights movement as a series of spiritual miracles. And it's no insult, but none of us knew what we were doing.
So you're saying now, though, that, like I cover race and culture for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and as you can see, I'm an African-American. So you're saying it's important for us, you know, as great as Taylor Branch's book was, it's important for us to tell our own stories.
It's important to tell our own stories, but also to be able to try to reconstruct the anxiety, the emotion, the faith, and the belief in miracles. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think of my life as a pre-planned miracle, and I didn't have anything to do with the planning.
Why is it a miracle?
Well, because I was born in New Orleans, and I was born right in the middle of the block.
Okay.
And on one corner was an Irish grocery store. Another corner was an Italian bar. A Chevrolet dealership was around the fourth corner. And the Nazi Party headquarters was on the fourth corner.
Okay.
And I could not go anywhere without the possibility of conflict. And my brother and I, there were other black people in the neighborhood and in the block, but we were the only children.
Okay.
And I mean, I got nonviolent lessons starting at 4. When my father, we were walking past, my aunt lived 2 doors behind the Nazi Party. And there was no air conditioning, so the windows were open. So we could sit on her front porch and look in and see them Heiling Hitler and doing all their singing and everything. My father had to explain that to me. And what he said was that you know that God created of one blood all the nations of the world. You learn that in Sunday school. They don't believe that. They believe that they're white supremacists, see? And he said, but that's their problem, that's not your problem. And he said, they have to work that out with God. And he took me to the movie to see Jesse Owens in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And when Jesse Owens won the 100-meter, and Hitler, rather than giving him the medal, stormed out and took all of his Nazi stormtroopers with him. And my father said, but see, now watch what Jesse does. I said, he didn't do anything. He said, that's the point. He said he kept his mind on his business. And he just went on and won 3 more gold medals. And he said if he'd gotten upset about Hitler's actions, he might have gotten just 1/10 of a second slower, and he wouldn't have one of those gold medals.
So, No, I'm sorry.
No, but he said that you don't ever let anybody else's actions get you upset. And you don't get mad, you get smart. When you lose your temper, the blood rushes from your head to your fists, to your feet. And he was 5'4", and he said, you're never going to be big enough to beat up everybody. In fact, you'd be lucky, you can outrun people maybe, but you won't feel good about running from a fight. And he said, you have to learn to keep you cool and let your mind lead you through whatever trouble you're in.
Now, you said in retrospect that navigating that corner, those 4 landmarks on that corner, prepared you for work in civil rights, it prepared you for work as an ambassador But when you were 5 and 6 years old and you were navigating those streets, did it hit you then? Did you understand what you were
I didn't.
learning?
I mean, I was trying to get to my aunt's house. I was trying to get to the grocery store. I was just trying to live in the neighborhood, see? And my grandmother wasn't quite so nonviolent. And she said, and she never said about it, it was all right for you to call me a nigger, but if you let anybody pick on your little brother and you don't beat him, I'm gonna beat you when you get home.
Okay.
So, and it didn't happen often, but it happened enough for me to have to know how to fight. And my daddy was a dentist, and he used the boxing arena was about maybe 7, 8 blocks from where we lived. And he was a boxing fan, as was everybody then. Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson, and I mean, boxing was big. And he, you know, they'd come to him as a dentist to get their teeth fixed, and their jaw showed up, and they never had any money, so the way he collected was, you have to take these boys to the gym and teach them how to defend themselves. So we were hanging out in the gym with prize fighters, but my mother worked next door to the Y, and we hung out at the Y when we weren't, you know, I mean, we had really excellent support systems for anything. And then, but in addition to living in that neighborhood, I had to go out of that neighborhood into another neighborhood. And my elementary school was called the Bucket of Blood, because there was so much violence and stuff going on there. And, you know, I got put out of school in 3rd grade.
For fighting? Or?
No, I was playing with an ice pick in the back of the room with another big guy. I was 6. I went to church nursery schools, and they let us learn. They taught us how to read and write and count and, you know, add and subtract. And so by the time I was old enough to go to public school, they put me in 3rd grade. Well, I was 6, and this other guy was probably 11 or 12. And I learned, if you're gonna get along when you're different, you know, hook up with the biggest, baddest, meanest guy in the class, which is what I was doing. And we were playing with an ice pick in the back of the room and got put out of school. The thing was that was no problem for me, because I knew I was going to get punished, and I called my parents, and they were there that same day to get me back in school. They didn't let me back in, but they let me back in the next day. The other kid never came back.
This is the story of Lincoln.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was, I didn't see him anymore and forgot about him till I was halfway through Howard University. And my daddy wanted me to be a dentist, and I knew I didn't want to be a dentist, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I didn't know how to differ with my father. I had too much respect for him, and he didn't give me much room. I had to be a dentist and baseball player, because that's what he did. But I was lifeguard at the swimming pool, and thinking about dropping out of college for a couple of years, when this guy came in and almost drowned. We pulled him out, and he was high on something, and he remembered me, and he even remembered the teacher's name, Miss Sarah Vokeland. He said, we got put out of Miss Sarah Vokeland's class in 3rd grade. And I said, golly, where you been? See? And he said, my mother was working for white folks for $1 a day plus car fare. And we had 6 of us in the family, and she couldn't take a day off to come see about me. So I said, well, what have you been doing? And he said, I've been in and out of every reform school and prison in the state of Louisiana, including Angola Penitentiary. And I told him I was kind of messing up in school because I didn't want to be a dentist, but I didn't know how to negotiate that. And I was thinking about dropping out. And he woke up and lit into me, and it was sort of like one of those Richard Pryor cussing outs, you know. I mean, he called me all kinds of MFs and threatened me. He said, if I ever hear that you have dropped out of school, I will track you down and give you the beating of your life. But he put it in other words. But what he said was, he said, you got a chance to do something with your life. And you better get your ass back in school. And you got to find a way to make the world better for people like me.
Now, you talk about miracles, and this is a perfect example of a miracle. You might be a miracle. You talked about how your high school class, a third of you all went to college, a third of you all ended up probably like Lincoln, and a third of you all went to the military. So what do you think, 90 years old that you are now, you think about, you know, growing up in the 1930s and 1940s in the Deep South, how you were able to make it out of there?
Well, one, we had good teachers.
Okay.
And the smartest people in town couldn't work anywhere else. And teachers devoted themselves to try to making their students successful. And so that was one thing. The other thing was that it was still the segregated South. And so I said a third of us went to jail, a third went to the military, and a third went to college. But it wasn't necessarily the smartest third that went to college. Okay. It was the ones that had the privileges and the opportunities. And in fact, as I got older and graduated from college, my classmates started coming back from the military. One of my college classmates actually ended up being appointed by Maynard Jackson as he was first or second general manager at the airport.
Oh, okay.
But he was a colonel in the Air Force.
Okay.
And was running airports around the world, and came back here. And he and I had been in college and belonged to the same fraternity.
Okay. All right.
But he was already in, and so I have one classmate that I know. In fact, he was the only one younger than me. And he went to California and ended up getting a doctorate from Berkeley. And I think his teaching was teaching in Oregon. And he will be, I think I turned 90 in March, he turned 90 in April.
Okay. So let me, for all of you who have a copy of the book, this is my travel copy. The name of the book is The Many Lives of Andrew Young. And I've asked you this question before. And you talked about, you alluded to the fact that you boxed and you ran track. But, you're 90 years old, as you mentioned. You look great. You talked about growing up in New Orleans, going to Howard University, one of the premier black colleges in the country. You worked with Martin Luther King Jr.?
Let me just say.
Okay.
It was one of the premier colleges in the country.
Okay. All right. And I see some bisons.
No, I get very angry with
Okay.
people here in Atlanta. I remember one day I was in a Morehouse board meeting, and somebody said, "We want to be the Harvard of the South." I said, "What the hell for?" I said, "Harvard gave us the Cold War, the war in Vietnam." I said, "Martin Luther King gave us a Peace Prize, damn it." You need to have Harvard become the Morehouse of the South.
I agree with
of the
that.
North. You know, and I think that there is something, and I mean, it's just miraculous how. I mean, I've been real good buddies with 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners.
Yeah, Martin Luther King.
And 3 if you're going to count Bishop Tutu, Desmond Tutu in South Africa, and the 2 ladies, I've forgotten their names, but who won the Nobel Peace Prize for Ireland, Northern Ireland peace movement, and I mean, it's inconceivable to me that, well, I say that, well, when Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, when Martin won the Nobel Prize, somebody bought a couple of bottles of champagne and we started toasting in Oslo, and Daddy King broke in and said, wait a minute, before you all start all this toasting, I want to make a toast to the one who brought us here. And he said, I want to drink a toast to God. And that's the only explanation.
So you mentioned that you know about working with the 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners from Georgia. That's Martin Luther King Jr. and Jimmy Carter. Talk about your relationship with them, or just how were they similar and how were they different? You know, you look at these 2 gentlemen, you know, both from Georgia, probably the 2 greatest Nobel Peace Prize winners ever.
Well, they were similar in that they didn't believe that anything was impossible.
Okay.
The way we used to say it is that the difficult we do immediately, the impossible just takes a little time. And I think that both of them would come up with things that in my right mind I thought was ridiculous. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. Well, when Martin won the Nobel Prize and we came back and went to see President Johnson, President Johnson talked for about a half an hour about why he could not pass a voting rights bill. And he had very good political reasons. And he said, I'm with you, I know we need it, I want to do it, I just don't have the power. And we left there, and I thought that was a perfect opportunity for him to Martin to take a sabbatical, because he could take off from December to November after the election. We could plan out how we wanted to change the nation, and so I started telling him that. He said no. I said no. Well, what? I said, well, what are we going to do? He said, we're going to get the president some power. I said, come on. You know, you Morehouse men. You can always tell a Morehouse man, but you sure can't tell him much. I mean, here you ain't got a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of, and you talking about getting the president some power. That's the most arrogance I've ever heard. And he kept on saying, he just kept saying, we got to get the president some power. And he must have said it 15 or 20 times walking from the White House in the dark down to the street where we caught a cab. And he just kept saying, I said, but we got to get the president some power. Well, what I didn't know was that Mrs. Amelia Boynton of Selma was calling his secretary, and 2 days later, she showed up in Atlanta with two ministers, and she started talking about all of the things that were going on in Selma. And the final one was that they wouldn't, Jim Clark, the sheriff, wouldn't let her even hold her husband's funeral in his own church because her husband was too political. And he didn't want politics in the church in Selma. And so when she came over and said that, he said, well, we usually celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation Day on the 1st of January. He said, that's a Sunday, but could we celebrate it with you on the Monday? And so we all went over there and broke the law by going to church and celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. But we didn't have any money. We didn't have any plans. It was just wrong what they were doing, and Dr. King felt that we should be there with them. And again, we scheduled this march from Selma to Montgomery because, because the federal judge that covered Selma was in Mobile, and he had been a Democrat appointee. And in Montgomery, it was Frank Johnson, who had been appointed by Eisenhower. And Frank Johnson was much more reasonable and principled. So the march from Selma to Montgomery was in many ways a march to get before a judge that believed in the Constitution and was willing to stand up for it. But we scheduled it on the wrong day. And Martin Luther King was not there. It was a leap year. And the 7th of March was the first Sunday. Well, preachers have to be in their pulpits on the first Sunday. So none of the big shot preachers showed up. And so it was left to John Lewis and Hosea. He told me, we figured we'd march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they would probably arrest a few folk or break us up or turn us around. But nobody anticipated the kind of massacre that occurred. And I wasn't in the front of the line only because he told me, don't you go to jail.
Okay.
And so I was at the back of the line, and I missed that beating.
You talk about you missed that beating, but in St. Augustine, you talked about that, and that's in the book about that confrontation that you had with the Klan there.
That was just before, that was June of 1964, and that was while the Civil Rights Bill was being filibustered by the Senate. And there were demonstrations going on in St. Augustine, and Dr. King was afraid that they would break out in violence. And so he sent me down there to stop the demonstrations. And I tried to stop them, and between Jose and a lot of wonderful people, they told me to go to hell. Or better still, you're going to lead this march.
You're going to lead it.
So I ended up leading the march, figuring I could get them up there, and I'd seen where the Klan was in the park. and there must have been 100 or so of them, and they were drunk and making a whole lot of noise and breaking bottles. And I go up there, and there was nobody but women and children. And so I didn't want them to get hurt, and I didn't want anybody to get hurt. So I left them on one side of the street, and I went over and figured I can talk to anybody. I mean, I grew up with people like that, see, and I was doing very good. And somebody came up behind me and hit me with something, and then I got stomped and kicked for a little while. I don't know how long, because I didn't even know about it until years later.
When you saw the footage?
When I saw the footage from the police camera, because there was no press there. And but I got up and we went down to the next corner, and you can't stop. You have to go on. And fortunately, this time there was the largest policeman I think I've ever seen. And what I later learned was that the sheriff had deputized the Ku Klux Klan to beat us up, and that the city police really were concerned about the tourist image of St. Augustine, and they didn't want any fuss. And so this great big guy came in, and when they were swinging at me again, I mean, I wasn't being, well, I was ducking and dodging, but I never stopped talking. And he said, "You all get out of the way and let these people through. You're gonna fool around here and kill somebody, and then you'll really be in trouble." And nice little old lady, you know, started on through behind me, and I remember somebody saying, "Damn, them niggas got some nerve." And this old sister said, "It ain't nerve, son, it's faith."
So you talked about how Martin Luther King has talked about it, being a civil rights leader in the 60s and 50s, in the 50s and 60s, that the specter of death was always there. So how did this attack on you, this beating of you, how did it change you, or how did it move you forward, or did it change you at all?
Not at all.
No? Why?
One, I was the only one who hadn't been beaten up, and it was just my turn.
Did you expect it to? You expected it to happen at some point, you think?
Oh, I mean, it was inevitable that it was going to happen, but you never know how it's going to happen, or when, or why. But almost everybody else. I mean, my job in Birmingham the year before was to talk to the white folks. And I mean, Martin said before we got there, he said, "Look, do you know any white people in Birmingham?" I said, "No, I've really never been in Birmingham much." And he said, "It's just December. We're not going to do anything there till almost February. You figure out how to meet some white folks in the next 30 days. And it turned out that I'd been at a church convention in Michigan, and I remembered meeting somebody from the Episcopal Church. And so I just picked up the phone and called the Episcopal Church and asked to speak to the director of Christian education. And she set up an appointment with the bishop, and I started talking to him and explaining to him that there were going to be serious demonstrations going on in about 30, 40 days, and that I would like to have an opportunity to get Dr. King together with the business community. So it wouldn't be a surprise, and we could prepare uh, for the difficulty and avoid, as much trouble as possible.
So I want to talk to you about your leadership of Atlanta, but I promised your granddaughter, Lena, that I would ask this question. You talk about the 50s and 60s and how dangerous it was and the attack that you suffered in St. Augustine. When you go home to your wife and to your family and to your children, what does your wife say to you when you tell her that, that you've been attacked?
Her grandmother, that was my first wife. We were married for 40 years. And
Jean Charles Young.
Jean Charles Young. And we went to Thomasville, Georgia, and our first encounter with the Klan was in 1955, running a voter registration drive. And there was a big Klan meeting. We'd been to Albany and came back the back way through Doe Run, Georgia, and Moultrie. And we found, it seemed like thousands of people in sheets. And so I started, they didn't bother us. We eased on through the crowd, but they were clearly setting up to march on Thomasville. And I told Jean I said, look, I'm going to talk to these folk, but it would help me if you would sit in the window with the rifle. See? And point the rifle at the guy I'm talking to, and then I can negotiate from a position of strength. See?
And you knew she was a good shot.
She's a very good shot. I mean, she was a country girl, and that was a country date. They had a gully that people used to throw, bottles and beer cans and things down there. And that was one of our dates. We'd get to 22 and we'd sit up there and break bottles, shooting into the ground. And she said, I can't do that. I said, you're a much better shot than me. She said, yeah, but I can't point a gun at a human being. I said, baby, but that's the Ku Klux Klan. And she said, yeah, and you're a preacher. I said, what's that got to do with it? She said, if you ever forget that under that sheet is the heart of a child of God, you need to quit preaching. I said, damn, woman, what is the matter with you? I said, do you realize? I said, do you realize we're in a shack? We couldn't even live downstairs. We were renovating the place at the top. And I said, if they just throw a cigarette butt on this porch, I said, this whole place will go up in smoke. And we'll all be dead. And she said, so? I said, so? I said, you got a 3-month-old baby there. And you and me. And there's no way to get out but this one door. And she said, don't you preach about the cross and the resurrection? I said, oh, shit. I said, what's that got to do with it? She said, everything. She said, if you don't believe in it, you need to find something else to do. And I realized she was serious. And so she pushed me to call up some of the elders in the community. And finally, I made it to the mayor and talked to the mayor on the phone. Much to my surprise, the mayor who ran the local hardware store called Sunnyland Packing Company and Flowers Bakery. And both of them said, we don't want any racial violence here in Thomasville. We don't want any trouble. He said, you let the Klan have their meeting on the courthouse steps, and you need to have the sheriff put some cars out at the church. Maynard Jackson's grandfather was coming down to speak to kick off the voter registration drive. And he was sort of the head of the black and tan Republican Party in the South. And I had been Democrat in school. And he said, but down here, if the Democrats win,
Eisenhower.
the Democrats win, Richard Russell and Senator Eastland will name the federal judges. And I said, and what happens? He said, if Eisenhower wins, they have very few white Republicans. And he said, and we know enough decent people to nominate judges that will basically fulfill the Constitution and obey the law. And that was 1955. And every judge that was appointed in the South where we had a victory was an Eisenhower appointee.
Oh, okay.
And the whole Fifth Circuit, here in Atlanta, down in New Orleans, the judge that sort of rescued me in St. Augustine, Judge Brian Simpson.
All Eisenhower.
All Eisenhower appointees.
Well, let's talk about Atlanta a little bit. But before, you were the mayor of Atlanta, and you mentioned your 3-month-old daughter at the time, Andrea now, who's now the executive director of the Georgia ACLU. And when I was doing research for the book, she mentioned how when you and her drive around town, how proud you are of seeing buildings and seeing how Atlanta has grown. So I want to talk to you about your legacy here, but I want to start when 2 of your first trips. Your first trip was a visit, you were saying at the Butler Street YMCA, and the Klan marched down
Well,
Auburn
yeah,
Avenue.
the first time I came here, I guess I was about 14.
Okay.
And I came to a meeting at the YMCA down on Butler Street, and the Klan actually marched down Auburn Avenue in their uniform. I mean, in the sheets. And I called home, and my mother said, you get to the train station and get on the next train coming back here to New Orleans, because we hadn't seen any Klan. So that's where, then when I was coming back after graduating from, hadn't graduated, but I was in seminary, and I remember I was driving from Connecticut down to Marion, Alabama, by myself in a little English Ford, and looked like a great big rat, but it was probably a possum.
Okay.
Cross Ponce de Leon, and I slowed down for the rat, because I figured rats had more rights than black folk in Georgia. And I did not stop. When I saw the Welcome to Georgia sign, I made a U-turn and went back to South Carolina to get gas. Because, Georgia had that kind of reputation. And I slowed down for the possum or the rat or whatever it was. And I didn't stop again until I got to Tuskegee, Alabama.
So with those two stories, you moved to Atlanta in 1961. You become mayor of the city in 1981, right? Is that 80? Yeah. So, okay, so how do you go from witnessing the Klan, slowing down for a possum, to moving here to becoming the mayor of the city? How does that all transpire?
Well, there was 10 years of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
And voter registration. I was actually here to teach people to read and write, to register to vote. And the other thing about Jean was a reading teacher, and she believed that everybody could read. They just didn't know they could read. So you hold up a sign, and everybody says Coca-Cola, you know, and you hold up another sign and it says Atlanta. And everybody knows, you know, 25 to 75, 100 words.
Yeah.
And she broke those words down into syllables and taught people to read phonetically. Now, she later on worked with IBM, and they did the same thing with computers, where they could take 4- and 5-year-olds and they would talk to the computer, and the computer would spell out what they were saying, and they taught themselves to read by talking to the computer. And that not only worked with 4- and 5-year-olds. When I became mayor, I realized that I think 16% of our workforce couldn't read and write in the city. And so we created we didn't call it a literacy class, we created a computer program. And we got the people who couldn't read and write, and we paid them 2 hours overtime, 2 or 3 times a week, and we let them use the same computers that the kids would use, but we'd upgrade something until they taught themselves how to read and write. Now, it was necessary to do that to register to vote, because you had to pass literacy tests. And so all of this worked together. And the reason I got hooked with Martin Luther King was that they wanted to give the money to SCLC, and SCLC didn't have any tax-exempt status. So my denomination, the United Church of Christ, you know, accepted the grant, and we renovated a facility over in Liberty County, Georgia, and we brought, during the 60s, we probably brought over 6,000 people from everywhere from Virginia to East Texas. And we brought them here to Georgia. And I mean, we didn't keep good records, but we did have a file with about 6,000 names and addresses in it. But the important thing was that who's the majority leader?
Clyburn.
Jim Clyburn. Jim Clyburn's parents were 2 of our first leaders.
Okay.
And so we really were training the grandparents of today's leaders. And we trained them, he was a minister, and we trained them to run voter registration classes in their churches, or beauticians in their beauty parlors, barbers. I mean, anybody that had a space that could conduct a class. And we were able to, I think, we gave the leaders $30 a month for gas, and gas back then was about 40 cents a gallon.
Don't mention gas.
Or less. And that could go a long way. Also, $30 a month was about all you could make picking cotton. You know, and so we really, people like Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi, and just almost anybody who's anybody that you've ever heard of, almost all of them came through our school down there at Dorchester, Georgia, in Liberty County.
So getting back to what Atlanta is now, and you know, you drive around, and we're in this beautiful facility now. There's this talk about Buckhead seceding perhaps. What gave you the vision for what you wanted to do as the mayor of Atlanta, expanding the airport,
Well,
getting the buildings?
No, see, the thing was that I was in Congress first.
And you don't want to be mayor.
And I didn't, but I was in Congress, and in Congress, I was on the banking committee. And from the banking committee, I went to the rules committee. But George Shultz was Secretary of the Treasury. And he came up to me one day after I asked a kind of, well, it was a smart question, but the head of the Federal Reserve kind of shut me up. And they were talking about devaluing the dollar or something like that. And I didn't know what they were talking about, but I asked the question. And he kind of put me down, you know, and puffing his pipe. But George Shultz came over to me and said, look, I go to all these international meetings, and I really feel reluctant because I'm always with an all-white delegation. Would you mind going to some of these international banking meetings with me? So I said, would I mind? You know, I love it. In fact, but it wasn't easy, and because the first place he was going was Jamaica, and I said, my wife is not going to like me going to Jamaica by myself. And he said, well, bring her along. And I said, we can't, because we have a 3-month-old baby. She said, good, my wife is a nurse. She would love to have a baby on Air Force Two.
Okay.
And so my son had a diplomatic passport at 3 months. And Dr. Shultz always, I mean, he took me to Africa, he took me to the Caribbean, meetings in Europe, and I was figuring out what was going on in the world. And I was in the circles where, even when I didn't know what they were talking about, I kind of put it together. And so when I came back here, well, I also went to the UN before that happened, and that put me in another 75 countries. You know, so by the time I got to be mayor, I'd been to 120 countries or so. And I knew enough about them, and I knew enough about the global economy to realize that we were in a recession and that there was no money in Washington. And our only hope was to make Atlanta an international city and become a part of the global economy. And I knew that the Germans had more money than they knew what to do with. The British were, I mean, everybody was doing well. And then I had learned about Wall Street, so that very few people realize that there's no taxpayer money in the Atlanta airport. I mean, we went straight to Wall Street, and we floated bonds, and we probably put somewhere close to $20 billion into that airport. And taxpayers have made money on it, but we haven't even made enough money because it's so complicated. We're part of Fulton, DeKalb, Clayton, you know, and so nobody wants us to collect sales tax there. But if we could just collect sales tax at the airport, it would be a boom, because I think last year 110 million people went through that airport, and we were the busiest airport in the world. But it hadn't cost the taxpayers any money, and it has generated literally billions of dollars for the entire region. And I knew about stuff like that. And, you know, working with Maynard and Herman Talmadge. Herman Talmadge was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And we had to move an expressway to make room for that airport. And nobody could have done that but Senator Talmadge. And we went to him quietly, and he said, leave it to me.
Okay.
And next thing I know, there was money in the budget to tear up Highway 85 and move it 2 miles, 3 miles to the west. And it just, everything just worked out.
Is that what gave you the idea or the sense that a southern city like Atlanta?
No, it was, I always knew that Atlanta, I mean, Atlanta's always had a vision. Mayor Hartsfield dreamed about an airport. He didn't have a way to get the money for it, the kind of money we needed, but he bought the land for $90,000. But he lost the election because he bought the airport land. And he bought the airport land, and he invited Delta to come over, and nobody had heard of Delta. Delta was a little crop duster airline in Louisiana. And then I think the thing that did him in was he put up red lights on Peachtree Street. and they voted him out of office. And,
all politics is local.
yeah.
Right? So,
But it.
are you ready for audience questions?
If y'all are ready to move to those, then we're at about an hour.
But
so-
let me just finish this and say that because I knew that there was surplus capital all over the world, right now, nobody thinks about Holland. But Holland probably has as large a budget surplus as our deficit. I mean, it's like 25 to 30 trillion dollars. Well, they got to invest that somewhere. Now, they invested it in Atlanta when I was mayor. I mean, they put $1.5 billion in Atlanta in my first term. The 2 Ritz-Carltons, and they put money out to get Dean Day Smith owned the land out there that's where the Twin Towers, the King and Queen buildings are. They put money out there, and then the Dutch Institutional Holding Company, everywhere I went in the world, they asked to tag along. And they told everybody else what a good place Atlanta was to invest and how you didn't have to pay anybody under the table. See, and that they had a good experience. And you have investors coming in from all over the world, but then you got Coca-Cola all over the world. That anywhere I wanted to go, all I had to do is call up Ingrid Sanders Jones or Carl Ware at Coca-Cola and say, who do you have in Berlin? You see, can I get them to pull the meeting together for me? And it was done. If I wanted to go to Mexico, or if I wanted to go anywhere I wanted to go, Coca-Cola was already there.
Yeah.
And they also knew the people who had surplus capital and who were looking to invest. And like the first time I said this in a meeting with a bunch of our bankers, the biggest shot in the group leaned over and told Charlie Loudermilk something, and they both broke out laughing, see? And so I asked Charlie, I said, what did he ask you? He said, you don't want to know. I said, no, I don't want to know, but I need to know because I need to know where we're starting. And he said, well, he said, Charlie, where in the hell did you get that crazy nut from? And I said, well, he probably used an N-word, but it wasn't nut.
Yeah.
See? But when I got ready, because I was talking about Japan coming here, and when we got ready to go to Japan, I insisted that he go with us. And it was one of those things where the Japanese prime minister had said something, made a boo-boo, and said something that got everybody here in the U.S. all worked up, and they were talking about, you know, impeaching him. And when the press gathered, normally they have an international gathering, and there were 20, 25, you know, journalists that show up. But because the prime minister had made this mistake, there were almost 200 people at the press conference. And when they asked me what I thought about what he said, I said, well, you know, we are doing some business together. I don't know him personally, but when I come to Japan, and Sam Nunn and I were picked out to go to Japan in 1973, 4, as the first delegates for interparliamentary exchange. And so I said, I don't know how to use chopsticks. I know you're supposed to bow to some people, but I don't know who to bow to. And I said, I said, my Japanese friends are very generous with me, and they put up with all of my mistakes. And I said, that's what we have to do when you come to the United States. And you will not understand the complexity of our society, but with our help, you'll be able to move in, get along with our legislature, our city council. And I also did another thing. Everywhere I went, anybody that wanted to come to Atlanta, I gave them my direct line in City Hall and my home phone number. And I said, you don't have to pay anybody under the table.
Okay.
And if you are not getting good service, don't complain to the press or anybody else. Call me personally. And I only got one call in 8 years. But that was from Japan, and the guy had had a bad experience in Ohio. And when he finally got settled here, we got him set up here, they wouldn't turn the lights on. Okay. And so he called me at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Japan, and said, you all are just like everybody else, only they charge you first, and you want to hit us up now that we all got our building up and everything's going. My president is coming there Monday, and here Friday you tell me you can't turn the lights on. I said, hold up. So I called, I think it was Norman Copeland, whom many of you know, who was, I could wake him up any time of the night. I said, Norman, what the hell is wrong? And he said, there's nothing wrong. He said, remember, we couldn't turn on the lights at the airport until we had the insurance. And he said, as soon as they give us an insurance number, the lights will be on in 10 minutes. Okay. And so I called him back, got the insurance company numbers, and the lights went on, and he talked all over Japan, you know, about how good it is to do business in Atlanta. So the next time I went, when Coca-Cola set up the meeting, we had about 30 or 40 companies every hour. I mean, we would meet with 100 companies a day. Wow. But you'd get the, you know, the pharmaceuticals at one time, and then you take a break, and then there would be the automobile dealers, and then the plastics people, and
Technology.
they were all in categories, and somebody was ready to find a way, because the Japanese market was overcrowded, and they needed someplace to move. And the same thing is happening right now with Korea. Korea is booming, and they got to have somewhere to grow. And Korea is about the same size as Georgia, but they got almost 90 million people. We got 9 million. You know, so they can't grow food on half of their land. And so knowing the countries and knowing people and having the network that has been growing, you know, here with Coca-Cola, Delta, and we're pretty well set to do, well, to make things happen here in Atlanta.
Okay. Were there any questions from the audience?
We have time for a few audience
Okay.
questions. I'll start here and then going there.
So we have, okay.
This question is for either of you. On page 195 in the Olympic section, you stated, Ambassador Young, I didn't have any shining moments at the Olympics. But for anyone who was there when you reopened Centennial Park after the bombing, many folks might respectfully disagree. That was an incredible moment for the city. So my question is, was there a conscious or intentional decision to leave out the bombing in the book, or that moment in the book? What went into deciding not to mention that part of the Olympic experience that you had?
Well, I don't know. It was critical, but I made about no more than 10-minute speech. And for the life of me, I couldn't remember after I finished what I had said. And so it was critical for rallying. I mean, remember, we had over 250,000 volunteers. And so it was all we had to do was encourage people to go back to work. And you figured they might be afraid. Or you figured that there were many reasons that people would be, shocked by the violence. And we were. But once we kind of got together, and Billy Payne pushed it on me, and I'm the preacher, but I for the life of me, I have no idea what I said. And when I saw it years later, I was surprised. And so I you do what you have to do, and you can't celebrate it if you don't understand it. And so really almost all of this I consider spiritual. That who was it? Moses. And Moses said, what is that you have in your hand? And he threw it down, and he said, pick it up. And he said, I made your mouth, and I will put words in it. Don't worry what you'll say when you're delivered up. That was one of those kind of Moses moments for me, that they threw the ball to me, and I punted it. I don't know, that was, I heard it, well, I went up to speak at Yale Business School, and this group of businessmen played that speech as how to respond to a crisis. And it was the first time I'd heard it. And I said, damn, that's pretty good. But, you know, for the life of me, I couldn't have said, when I sat down, I don't know what I said.
And let me say this. The name of the book is The Many Lives of Andrew Young. And, you know, for those of you who have a copy of the book, it's 11 chapters, and each chapter is a life of Andrew Young. So, you know, his life as an ambassador, his life as the mayor, his life, you know, running the Olympics or getting the Olympics to the city, as a congressman, as a civil rights leader. All of those lives or chapters could have been books unto themselves. If you follow, I think his name Robert Caro, who's written these, you know, every year he writes a book, every 10 years he writes a book about LBJ. And this is something I could have done, or I can still do, but, you know, when you ask about what's out of the book and what's in the book, there's so much to this 90 years of life that Andrew Young has given us that we had to make some editorial decisions as to what we put in and what we leave out. So, you know, once I start writing more books about him, getting each chapter together, we'll get all those stories. But it's just so much. The life is just so rich and so powerful that it's a lot of stuff that, you know, like he said, he hadn't even heard the speech until years later. You know, he hadn't seen the St. Augustine attack until years later. So there's so much packed into his life that, you know, some things just kind of go overlooked, you know. Yes.
Thank you. And we have one final audience question tonight before we move on to the signing.
Okay.
Ambassador Young, you and I grew up in the same church in New Orleans, Louisiana, Central Congregational. I want to ask you if you would share some of your fondest memories of that faith community, but also talk about the work that faith communities need to do now and need to be doing now to reconcile what is indeed such a fractured country, city. Thank you. Hi, Andrew.
Well, I grew up in Central Congregational Church in New Orleans, and again, they put me in nursery school. I must have been 2.5 or something like that. I don't know how old I was, but they taught me to read, and they taught me to count, and they taught me, I mean, they believed in education, and they didn't believe in limiting your learning. And so the United Church of Christ really started with the liberation movement, with the abolition movement, with the Amistad mutiny. And that led John Adams, the second president, did some of the legal work to free those slaves. And John Quincy Adams, his son, who was the sixth president, argued the case before the Supreme Court. And they've always had that education tradition. The Amistad slaves were put in prison in New Haven, and it was Yale Divinity School students that learned their language, that organized the case, and that that's a very human story about how slavery came to an end. It was really a struggle, and that was the beginning of this church. It was also probably one of the more progressive churches because it was the first one to ordain black folk, but also the first one to ordain women, and approved of gay marriage. And they've always been out there trying to reflect what, they're for everything the Supreme Court is against now. And it's been growing gradually. I think 1837 was the year of the Amistad mutiny. So but most of these historically black colleges were founded as part of that movement. One of the reasons why Coca-Cola runs Africa is that there's an Adams College that was formed 18 years before Atlanta University, and that before they could get south to help educate slaves, they had sent missionaries to South Africa, and Adams College, named for John Adams, was where Nelson Mandela and not Bishop Tutu, but anyway, it's where most of the African National Congress went to school. It also happened to be the place that educated the Kunini brothers, who owned South African breweries. And the reason Coca-Cola runs Africa right now and is the largest employer in Africa is that Carl Ware knew them, and instead of pulling out of South Africa, he sold the Coca-Cola franchise to 5 black brothers, and then agreed that the profits would go into Bishop Tutu's children's fund to care for the refugees that were displaced by apartheid. And so it's a part of all of our history.
Her question also hinted at, if we have a few minutes, her question also hinted at what's going on in America now. I know you were in Congress during Watergate, and what are your thoughts, watching the January 6th committee hearings?
Well, I think that you see democracy gradually unfolding. That nobody told us that the way would be easy, but I don't believe that God brought us this far to leave us. And so what we're going through now is trying to let the conscience of a people catch up with the vision and the technology, and everything's going on at a different pace. And Atlanta, under Mayor Hartsfield and Ivan Allen and Mr. Woodruff, this was the most progressive city in America, maybe in the world. There was nobody that had the kind of vision about, we were the only city that voted for mass transit when the federal government was giving 90 cents on a dollar. All you had to do was come up with 10 cents sales tax, 10% sales tax, and you got 90 cents. And we were the only city. And it was Atlanta, it was Fulton and DeKalb County. And both counties together only won by 400 votes. So nobody ever said democracy was easy. But we used to sing a song, freedom is a constant struggle. We struggle so long that we must be free. I just think that I think we're on the verge of a positive revival of the democratic spirit on the planet. I mean, and it's not just us. I mean, the people in the Ukraine are fighting for democracy, and they are really suffering, and we're helping, but we're helping in a different way than we did with World War II. With World War II, it was lend-lease, and we soon got involved. President Biden has made it very, very clear that we are not going to risk any American lives in Ukraine. Well, Jimmy Carter is the only president, I think, in these United States that in 4 years did not kill a single person in war, nor lose a single American in war.
Yes.
You know, and we take things for granted, but I mean, Camp David was a miracle. And, you know, President Carter poured his heart into it, and it had failed. And he somehow got the inspiration to give them a picture. And so as they were packing to leave, he gave Sadat a picture of himself with his own grandchildren. And he gave Prime Minister Begin a picture of himself with his grandchildren. And just seeing their grandchildren suddenly made them realize what the message. The message was, if you don't do this, you're just passing it on to your grandchildren. And they stopped, unpacked their bags, and in 3 more days they had a treaty in which nobody has killed anybody between Israel and Egypt in over 50 years. And it just took a lot of guts and a lot of patience and a lot of vision for President Carter to accomplish that. But it wasn't an accident that he stumbled in on. When he swore me in as ambassador to the UN, he gave me a little handwritten note. I want you to go to Africa and ask African leaders what they expect of us and how we might help them. Well, I don't think there's ever been another president that had asked somebody else's advice before he took office. But he found out from Sadat and Begin that neither of them wanted war. He found out when Rosalind went to Panama, went to Mexico, she found out that the Panama Canal needed a treaty. And all of those things were against the grain. And if we had been able to get release of the hostages and Carter had been reelected, the world would be a much different and better place.
So much in this book.
Can I ask one final going away question? Okay. Okay. Small question.
A tiny
Okay,
question.
so a tiny question. And this is another question from Linda. So we're going to end on this. Why was it, the name of the book again is The Many Lives of Andrew Young. Why was it important for you at the age of 90, with your long life, with your rich career, to tell your story this time? Why is it important for the younger generation, your grandchildren, to know your story?
Well, I don't know, but when they started talking about celebrating my 90th birthday, I said, look, I only have one responsibility in this, and that is to make it to 90. How you all want to celebrate it and what you want to do about it is somebody else's problem. And I really, I'm really blessed with a lot of really bright, hardworking, good friends who saw things that I didn't see and who had experiences that I hadn't experienced, that I didn't have. And they knew how. I think they put this together about 3 months.
Yeah, about 3 months, yeah.
I mean, it was about 3 months. I'm terrible with names. Beautiful lady in the red.
Amanda Brown Olmsted.
Amanda Brown Olmsted. I think it was your idea to put together something like this, see? And then Don Bermudez is from New Orleans, so he knew about all of the papers of my mother's in Tulane. He had been to that Amistad Memorial Museum. He also knew that I had to get, you accumulate a whole lot of junk. But people think the junk is important. And I gave all of the stuff that was in my house to the Auburn Avenue Library because they had a new building and 5 empty floors. But it was humidity controlled, and I remember somebody, and I won't say who, was cleaning out Dr. King's desk. And they pushed stuff in a garbage bag and put it out on the curb. And fortunately, one of my assistants picked it up and put it in the trunk of his car. And it was a couple of years later, but he was trying to pay his son's tuition and was broke. And he decided to look and see what was in that bag. And he found a letter with Dr. King's handwriting on it. And he put it on eBay. And that one letter got $64,000 on eBay. And he sent his kid to college. But I'm saying that I wanted us to keep our history available and alive, and I wanted it accessible. And I think we did the same thing with the Olympics. The other thing is, we put on the biggest and best Olympics ever, and we didn't use $1 of public money. It was all private money, contributions, gifts, and sponsorships. We raised $2.5 billion privately. We had more athletes, more countries, sold more tickets than any other Olympics in history. And we had $100 million left over. And that's what sort of went into Centennial Park. So the same thing is true of the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. No government money in that. That's all. And I think we're the only city that I know that really knows how to use Wall Street. And that's, I call it public purpose capitalism. That when we decide that there's something we want to do, we don't have to have the money. If we can define it so that everybody is treated fairly and everybody has a chance to make a profit in their area, if we can structure the deal right, we can go to Wall Street and get it financed, especially now because we got such a good reputation. I've been trying to buy a tax-exempt municipal bond since I was mayor. You can't buy them because when people hear about us selling them, somebody who knows they're a good investment buys them up. And all I wanted was one to put on my wall because really, I mean, I don't even think most of us as mayors knew what we were doing. The state legislature wants to take over the airport, but they don't have a clue. They can't afford it. You know, the state doesn't make the money here. The city makes the money. The income value of the city of Atlanta is just about $400 billion annually. That makes the city metropolitan Atlanta just about the size of Norway or Denmark in terms of, you know, economics. And we have a good reputation, and that's what I get on your folk about. They always worrying about nickels and dimes in the Constitution, and they don't realize that there's billions of dollars that are moving, and you know, they write about somebody using the city credit card. But when it happened to me, fortunately, it was the guy that was with me was a respected white gentleman, but he lost his suitcase going into Nigeria. And it's hard to find underwear in Nigeria. And so I had to send somebody with my credit card to buy him some drawers. You know, and it didn't get to the newspaper then, but if it had been a lady, it probably would have.
So I think you guys are. Yeah. So I think I want to thank you all. Thank you very much for your wonderful stories, for this book, for your wonderful life. Let's give it all a hand for Ambassador Andrew Young. And are we signing anything or?
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate you coming and supporting Ernie and, of course, Ambassador Andrew Young. We will meet you in the Draper Room after this for signing if you'd like to get your book personalized. More books are available for purchase out in the lobby. I don't know if you heard it. We have a little bit of a thunderstorm going on, so please be very, very safe and careful on your way home tonight. Thank you so much, everyone.